Hey everybody, I hope you appreciate this episode of the Preacher Boys podcast. If you'd like to support the mission of the show and help stories like this be told every single week, then you need to head over to patreon.com/preacherboys. That's patreon.com/preacherboys and become a patron today for any amount. Thank you so much for your support of the show and enjoy the rest of the episode.
Trigger warning. This podcast contains descriptions of various abusive situations. Listener discretion is advised. You are listening to the Preacher Boys Podcast, a podcast shedding light on decades of mental, physical, and sexual abuse within the independent fundamental Baptist movement. The testimonies shared on this podcast are told from the personal experience and perspective of the survivors. Not all legal outcomes are known or final. Any suspect is presumed innocent until proven guilty in the court of law. To find more information about the Preacher Boys podcast and upcoming documentary, visit preacherboysdoc.com or connect on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter with the handle @preacherboysdoc. Now, here is your host, Eric Skwarczynski.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Preacher Boys podcast. I'm of course your host, Eric Skwarczynski, and on today's episode, I'm joined by Jen Lord. Jen shares her story about growing up in a pretty difficult family situation and finding acceptance, at least at the beginning, from an independent Baptist church. She talks about the increasing level of control that the church took over on her life, eventually leading to her attending Commonwealth Baptist College in Lexington, Kentucky, where she talks about the toxic college environment, the confusing way that women were taught about sexuality, and how to focus on their appearance to impress the boys that were at the college. And we talk a little bit about the double standards of constantly focusing on male-female relationships, but also the extreme amount of suppression that happens at the same time within IFB churches and colleges. Jen then talks about just her experience getting out of it, talks a little bit about the things now that she sees that are inconsistencies within the movement and the doctrine inside of it. And so there's a lot of really good stuff here. Jen is really an amazing guest. And even though this episode is a little bit shorter than most, I think we cover a lot of really interesting ground. And it's going to be an episode that you're not going to want to miss 1 second of. And please, guys, do me a huge favor. If you enjoy any of these episodes on the Preacher Boys podcast, please head over to iTunes and leave a 5-star rating. I've noticed a couple of 1 stars coming in after naming a couple of larger colleges and churches. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but I think there's a clear correlation there. But if you could go ahead and leave a review, share what you love about the show, and get the rating bumping back up, and give this an opportunity to really be seen by more people within the Apple algorithm. So just head over to the Apple Podcast app, look for the Preacher Boys podcast if you're not listening there right now, and leave a 5-star rating and a review. It would really mean the world to me. And above all that, share this episode and all the others with friends who would need to hear it. So, all right, guys, without any further ado, let's head into the episode with Jen Lord.
All right, Jen, thank you so much for joining me on the Preacher Boys podcast. Now, I know I gave a little bit of context about who you are in the introduction, but can you just introduce yourself and kind of let our listeners know how you got introduced to the independent Baptist movement?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. So I'm 23 years old. I currently I wouldn't say not attending a church right now, but I mean, currently because of the pandemic going on, I did find one that I had liked, but, to backtrack a little bit, I had started off my life and I wasn't raised in a Christian home. They would call it a broken home. My mom and dad were divorced when I was about maybe 5 or 6, and my mom soon after remarried to a man who was unfortunately addicted to heroin at the time. And, when I was growing up, everything was so extreme. Everything was so chaotic. And, there was never that moment of peace. There was such a drawing for me of these extreme things. I think that's partly why I was so drawn to the Independent Fundamental Baptist Church, because when I had my own journey with my addiction and watching my mom and her husband go through it, my step-siblings, cousins, family members, they never found recovery and they never found that hope. And I believe that, if I go to this church, if I just trade one extreme for the other, everything will be fine and it'll all be fixed. And I won't have to go to this scary therapist and be on these scary medications, because that's unfortunately how a lot of these circles paint the picture of therapy and mental health and everything along those lines. And for a while, I was feeling like I'm successful in this. I'm getting so much praise
Right.
because I'm passing out these gospel tracts and I'm at church, 3 days a week, and I'm volunteering in the nursery and vacation Bible school, and every ounce of my energy and time was going into that. And to turn around and have people start to shame you because you start thinking independently or start to maybe question things that you're being taught, all of a sudden you're this black sheep almost. I remember
Right.
I had asked my pastor, naturally at the time I was wanting to go to Bible college. I wanted to be some sort of pastor's wife or in the ministry of some capacity. And he gave me a list of 2 Bible colleges. One of them was Hyles Anderson College, and the other one was Commonwealth Baptist College in Lexington, Kentucky. And
Okay.
I went there, and from growing up so independently, I made my own decisions. I went where I wanted to go. I made my own schedule. I pretty much took care of myself, to being an 18-year-old woman going into college, telling you what you have to wear, what you have to eat, what you have to learn, what you have to do, how to walk. I remember sitting in a Christian womanhood class, and they mentioned some Christian contemporary song, and they said, "Who knows that song?" And I naturally raised my hand because I liked the song and I thought it was a nice song. And in front of all the women there, they said, "Now, you're going to have to do a lot of learning about why that's so wicked." And I just felt like the smallest person on the earth. And that's when I thought, if the God of all love that I've been taught to know about, if he's real, there's no way he would stand me in front of these people and shame me like this. And eventually I did end up getting kicked out of that Bible college, and it was things like not wearing pantyhose and somebody, told on you, or not having everything in your room arranged exactly how it's supposed to look. And I mean, it felt like we were just learning nothing really about the Bible, nothing about spirituality. It felt like all the women there were just learning about how to serve the men. And I don't want to get anybody wrong. I believe, that there are some things that I did take away from there that were good. I do think that there are things that I learned in my personal experience that were good. But I think a lot of it is grooming people, young men and young women, to take abuse and to accept it and
Right.
think that it's love when it's not. It's the absolute opposite of love.
Right. Well, I think you kind of hit on that when you were talking early on when you first joined the church. And I've talked about this with other guests, but there seems to be, with a lot of these churches, when there's a new member, there's this honeymoon period of, there's a lot of reward for being there. There's, obviously, like on special Sundays and stuff, they bring in visitors with, a gift or with some, way of showing, quote unquote, love to the community. And even early on in the first few months, there's typically incentives and encouragement to, do different tasks, like to change the types of clothes you're wearing, or to participate in the choir, or in some, nursery or ministry or things like that. But as you go in, the amount of control starts to increase and the amount of reward starts to decrease. And it kind of sets you on this hamster wheel of moving really quickly and trying to do as much as you can to earn, like you said, it feels good when people reward you, or when, the pastor points you out and says, "Oh, you're doing a great job." Like that gives you a dopamine rush of, oh, this feels amazing. Like I'm doing something that has purpose.
Right.
But also, like you said, it sets you up for abuse, in the sense of, when you become that reliant on people for approval, then they can use that as severe leverage, especially in a Bible college setting. And
And
some
I
of
think
them,
that it also becomes a little bit almost, speaking from my own personal experience, I became almost codependent with the leaders at the church. Like if I
right,
saw that, they were off and, they were, beating down the people at the church, it it would affect me, and it would be like the whole spirit of the church would change. And it was like, oh,
mm,
I remember coming home sometimes on Sunday from church, and some of my family members that didn't attend church were like, why are you in such a bad mood whenever you come home from church? And it was like, I felt like, oh, I'm not putting a smile on my face. I'm not showing them that I'm happy. But in reality, I wasn't happy. And I
right,
think for a lot of people, especially young people that are coming from backgrounds where they grow up on survival and not love, that little bit of love that is shown, that is secretly snuck in, wrapped in abuse, that little bit of love is taken and ran with it. And it personally hits me on another level, because that's just taking advantage of people that already have nothing.
right. I'm so glad you said that, because that's one conversation that I've had quite a bit with my wife, especially. Is like and I actually was talking to her about today, is that there is some things within the IFB movement, and of course, not every single church that calls itself IFB is like this, but
Right.
there is a common pattern across the
Correct.
US of churches taking advantage of people who are either coming from a severe low income background, from an abusive situation, from basically any kind of strong emotional situation that can be used to manipulate. And I was talking to someone today, and I'm sure someone listening might think this is a tinfoil hat type, conspiracy theory, but it's one of those things where, I said it's not any coincidence that a ministry like First Baptist of Hammond with Jack Hiles was busing in
Oh
kids
yeah,
by the
I
hundreds.
know many people that have attended that college, and I actually got reprimanded
Mm,
when I got home from being kicked out of the college that I went to. And they said, when I got reprimanded, they said, it's a good thing you didn't go to Hiles Anderson. You would have put us to shame.
you would have brought shame on them by attending the college, or by having been kicked out of a college of that level in their eyes?
Oh, by being kicked out of a college of that level, Jack
Okay,
Hiles, that whole
right,
scene, they would talk about him like he was God almost.
right,
And, I would bring up, some things that he had said that, to us don't sound like, quote, the Christian thing to say, but whenever I would bring those subjects up, it was always hush hush. And then
okay,
it was always, well, Jen's just the weird girl that goes to our church that has theories about everything. But,
right,
I really, at this point in my life, I want to stand up for what's right. And I believe the obligation of the youth is to defy corruption. And I think that there's a lot of corruption that goes on there. I mean,
right,
there was even times where I would say, hey, let's, as a church, why don't we get together and like make a meal, make a whole big meal for like the project community, the low income community. Let's go
mm,
do something for them. Like let's take us, this church, and bring it to them. And it was always, no, you got to get them to come in, and or they're a bunch of freeloaders. And it's just
right,
the Independent Fundamental Baptist Church is run a lot more like a business than I think a lot of people realize.
right. Yeah, no, I definitely see that. It seems like the low income communities are often served if they can offer some kind of service in return. And so, you know,
Correct.
if they can't bring money, they can be the ones that volunteer or clean the building or paint or go out and
100%.
pass out flyers, that kind of thing. Yeah, I really, like I said, I'm really glad you hit on that, because one of the things, even when I was just initially getting outside of it, one of the things I had a big problem with was this reward kind of system that was built up early on. And it was one of those things of, when you're bringing in kids by offering candy and things in exchange for services, that relationship isn't going to change suddenly once they become an adult. And it's not going to shift to a
Right.
healthy relationship later on. So you're teaching essentially from the beginning that you come here to get something from us, and in return we expect service from you. And that's a really unhealthy relationship for a church and church attendee to have.
And it's not
So
unconditional love either.
exactly, yes, that's a big part of
I
it.
mean, I can say that because I was a bus captain. I was a bus
Yeah.
worker. My dad drove the church bus for a long time, you know.
Right.
And I was a bus kid at one point. When I very first started going to church, I would ride the bus on Sundays, you know.
Right.
And I'm even still, I would say I'm about a little less than a year out of the Independent Fundamental Baptist Church, but there's still I still get backlash to this day. You know, there's still people that attend my old church, and you know, I'll get a random rude text from somebody, you know, or we're praying for you because you know we know that you're living such a sinful life, and I'm like, actually, I'm to be totally fair, I'm the healthiest mentally, spiritually, and physically that I have ever been in my life, and I believe that if one does choose to look towards, you know, a higher power, God, whatever, you know, you choose to call it, you know, it's got to be a God. It's got to be something that is got an unconditional love, a love that is going to give without expectation, that's going to have those open arms, that's not waiting around the corner to strike you every time you quote do something wrong. You know, I never understood why you're gonna, you know, we preach, you know, our sins are forgiven past, present, and future, but then why are they being brought up in every single sermon and being beaten over
Mm,
our heads with them? I thought
right.
they were in the sea of God's forgetfulness. Why are, you know, I don't believe that we are to be bringing something up that he's already forgotten. You know, that's torture.
No, I definitely agree with that. And it just circles back to that thing of if you can keep people constantly seeking approval, they're very easy to control. And one of the things you kind of hinted at
Correct.
earlier, I know we talked briefly before we hit the record button, but you mentioned at the college there was, I mean, especially for women in the IFB, it's not a positive environment. And what your experience was like at Commonwealth?
One of the biggest things that I took from the college itself was when we had to wear, there was a very, very strict dress code. You would have every day before you would leave your room, you would have a room check to make sure that you were dressed appropriately, that you had your pantyhose on or nylons, whatever you want to call them.
And who
If
did the
you were
room check?
wearing
Just
leggings,
like a dorm supervisor or someone?
yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So the dorm supervisor would come and make sure that you were dressed appropriately. She would measure, you know, your skirts, you know, your tops, make sure that if you were a fuller figured woman, if it was fitting too tight, she would ask you to go back in and change and put on something looser. I know that one of the biggest things was during our ladies devotionals was there was a lot of there was a lot of freshmen that were not wearing pantyhose. I can't believe I'm saying this. There's a lot of freshmen that were not wearing the pantyhose, and we had to have a meeting about it. And our dorm supervisor said, "Well, it doesn't make you more holy, but the men love it." And then all
Hmm.
of a sudden, you see all these girls with their faces all lit up, and it's just like, no, that's not your worth. That's not your value. That's not why you should put something on or not put something on. You should
Right.
put it on because you want to do it, because it pleases you. It makes you feel happy and beautiful. You know, as a woman, it makes you feel like your best self by
Right.
wearing something. But rather instead it was wear this so that the men, you know, can look at you and be pleased by you. There was a
Right.
really big push on, you know, us getting married and finding, you know, they would always say your true love is, you know, somewhere in these pews. And there's
Right.
so many couples I know that that got married right out of college. They didn't even finish college, and now they've got 3 kids and are foreclosing on their house. I mean, it's just not right to do to these young people. You're not preparing them for real life. You're just painting a picture for them and saying, okay, go play house and give your money to the church.
Right. Well, it's kind of a double-edged sword too, of, when it comes to the idea of the dress and modesty thing, of like, you have to look good to appease the men because the men within the IP system are supreme. But then also, if you look too good, then you're going to be called a harlot or temptress or all these different things. And same with relationships, like you're being told constantly, and it's kind of a weird thing. Like there's a lot of sexualization when you listen to the preaching from a lot of IP pulpits, and a lot of conversation about, finding someone to be with, and, all those different things. But also at the same time, you're told not to talk about that sort of thing. So it leads to this really weird juxtaposition for college students where, they're extremely interested in all of those subjects because it's being pounded from the pulpit over and over and over again. But they also aren't allowed to discuss or show any of those feelings or thoughts or work through any of those things in the college experience.
And I honestly think it's such robbery, and it's one of the worst things, because you're taking that opportunity away from these, and mind you, I couldn't believe some of these people that were my age and older than me. They, were like, they knew I was from up north, and once I got there, everybody kind of said, well, she's not a preacher's daughter. Oh, she's a bus kid. Okay, so she's not up on the totem pole. So they would say, have you ever held a guy's hand? Have you ever sat next to a guy? And I'd be like, yeah, I have. I mean, what, and then it's like I've watched these young people go from like, they can't even talk about it, to now all of a sudden, they're pregnant and their church is shaming them for something that they weren't even educated about. These poor kids are going out into the world with nothing. They say, we're preparing you for the real world and the real battle. No, you're harming them. You're literally harming them. I remember going in the back of my college and, just to go for a walk by myself to think, and there'd be couples like running out of the bushes, don't tell the dorm supervisor, don't tell the dean. And I'm like,
right.
And I would talk to them and I'd be like, how is it that we can't even have a conversation as adults about these natural things, but yet but marriage and having children and, making a home is being forced on us. I like that you're setting them up for failure. I remember one of my really good friends who I still keep in contact with. She was, dead set she's going to marry a missionary, and her parents were very much into the Independent Fundamental Baptist Church. They still are very heavily, as far as I know. And it started out really good, and they pushed her to get married, pushed her to have children, and she ended up in a domestic violence situation and had to restart her whole life again with her 3 children. I would never say, those children are so beautiful and so wonderful, and they're such a gift to the earth. But however, they don't deserve to come into a life of trauma. They don't deserve to open their eyes, and feel fear in the middle of the night. They don't deserve that. Right. And it makes me upset because it's the ripple effect. You tell one person, get married, have children, be submissive, and then all of a sudden, their whole life is upside down because they tried to do what they were told, and it totally backfired on them. What are they going to think of God? What are they going to think of other churches?
You did mention the abuse side of things, and one of the things you also mentioned earlier was that there was a lot of cover-up of this kind of stuff. Can you talk about maybe some of the abuse you saw? I know you gave a few examples, but how you saw it, dealt with or handled either in the church or in the college?
Yeah, so in the church, I know that there was a lot, and not just in my church, but in many churches. I know of one of mine and one in Ohio that, unfortunately, a lot of young people were being sexually assaulted by some leaders in the church, whether it be deacons, ushers, assistant pastors, youth pastors. They were being sexually assaulted, and the ones that said something were told, that was God's plan to teach you something,
Right.
and the authorities were never involved. And then there's, the people in which case who are sexually assaulted, and they know in the depths of their heart, they know if they said something to the pastor and his wife, they would deny it.
Right.
And they would come up with an excuse. Let's say, for example, I know that a young woman had gone out and had a few drinks with her friends or something, and this has happened at a church when I was living in Kentucky, and she reported the sexual assault from somebody that was in her church. She reported it to her pastor, and he looked her in the eye and said, "You shouldn't have been out, and you shouldn't have been drinking, and you shouldn't have been dressed the way you were dressed."
Wow. So when you started hearing these stories or seeing these stories as a member or as a part of the college, how did it make you feel at the time, and how did you, I don't want to say justify, but how did you hear these stories and keep attending? And did you feel like, well, this is what people are telling me to think about it? Did it bother you, but you didn't think it was a pattern at that point? What was kind of your mindset? And because I think of stuff now, and there's things that I heard when I was attending where if I heard it now, I would walk out of a room. And when you're in it, you're sometimes desensitized to some of the more
I
crazy
would
statements
agree.
that are made.
So desensitized. I mean, because the way I look at it is, when you join, there's, like you said, that honeymoon stage, and then there's like a stage where you start, starting to learn everything, starting to try to reach other people and invite them to church. And then there's sort of this super high, and then it's super low. And then you're craving that quote unquote spiritual high that you know it happened at that place.
Right.
You knew it happened at that place. You knew beyond a shadow of a doubt it happened, and you so badly want to feel that connection and that. So at sometimes I was so desperate just for a feeling of emotion that I would crave those meetings. I remember a bunch of teenagers, we would be like, "Oh, I can't wait for youth camp so I can be on that mountaintop again." And then
Right.
they would preach and say, "Oh, your mountaintop experience, it's going to go away." And then slowly but surely, we all started to, kind of settle back in to where we were. And there was the problem is we were struggling with real problems, mental health disorders. People had horrible homes. People were struggling financially, physically, in all sorts of ways. And it's not going to be cured by that mountaintop experience. It's just not. When you get back to reality, they're going to preach, "Oh, the mountaintop experience is going away." And you're like,
Right.
"Oh, yeah, it is." And then you so desperately want to feel that happiness again, that cloud nine experience,
Right.
that you will do anything to stay. I mean, I would compare it to somebody using,
Yeah.
I
It's an
could compare
addiction.
it to my own struggles with addiction. You would do anything just to, like I said, when you grow up on survival, and I think a lot more people grow up that way than they realize. When you grow up on survival and not love, the littlest bit amount seems like the most amazing thing in the world, and you will do absolutely anything to get it again. But once I
Right.
started finding happiness outside of the church, once I started finding happiness in school and helping people in a career and friends, me and my best friend got our first apartment together. Once I started finding joy in things outside of the church, that's when I could look in and say, wow, what is going on in here?
Right. And when I don't know if this was your experience, but like in my experience, when you start finding joy, or, even if you're not necessarily leaving the church, like for me, when I first started making steps toward, hey, I'm gonna get involved in things that I want to be involved in, or I want to, I don't necessarily want to be a part of a choir in the church because I don't know how to sing, or I want to be involved in
Mm-hmm.
this instead. When you start finding happiness and the key word, I guess, identity outside of the church, because they're so possessive and they want your full attention, it's kind of like an abusive partner. They just start splitting ways, and you basically become dead to those who used to treat you like, in your mind at the time, treat you like gold. And
And
that's a
what's
hard thing to
funny is
deal with.
when I first started, when I first moved, just out of, and it wasn't like it was a bad move. I'm 22 years old, moving out of my parents' house, moving in with my best friend, and it was a 30-40 minute commute each way to get to church. And I started saying, I think I'm going to start looking for, one up here. And then it just started this uproar of, how could you move? How could you leave without asking
Right.
anybody? You didn't seek counsel. I can see a big storm coming for you. Only bad things are going to happen to you. And I honestly, in my own personal walk, the most interesting thing that's happened to me is the people that have said that I'm going to be unhappy have actually also left the church.
Wow. That's crazy.
And it doesn't make me think, oh, I was right. It makes me think somebody else is free. That's
Right.
honestly how I want to look at it, because there's so much joy in freedom. And I remember, I wish I could remember her name. I was listening to one of your podcasts with another woman, and she had said, does your faith stand up to, I think it's to scrutiny.
Hmm.
And it was just so profound to me. And I could just imagine all the times where our church, was maybe bashed or something like that. And the anger and the fire and brimstone that would come down when those things would happen. It's just like, it's not Christianity. And it's funny
Right.
because they want to teach people to have so much knowledge of the Bible, but then when you have that knowledge and then you question what they're saying in regards to what the Bible says, that's really when a lot of the tables started turning over.
Right.
I would say they would use verses in Deuteronomy and say, women should never wear pants. They should never wear, what a man should wear. And then
Right.
I would say, well, if you're, technically in their terms, technically, if you're rightly dividing the Bible, that doesn't apply to us right now as doctrine. And then, then all of a sudden I was a conspirator and I am the black sheep. I'm happy that I learned what I learned.
Right.
And I'm really happy to share my story and to be able to, and maybe share some hope, and to be able to maybe set some stepping stones for other people who feel like they want to find freedom.
Yeah, well, I definitely appreciate that, because it can feel, especially with a topic like this, it can feel like there's not much hope, or that hope's in short supply. And the truth is that there really is freedom. It takes, I mean, obviously it's not a quick and easy path there. You talked about, you know, climbing the mountain when the IFB, like when you do leave, it does feel like you fall a little bit initially, and people who
And you do start to question and say,
Right.
oh, am I one of those that they're talking about, the ones that have left the fold? Am I one of those? Am I the deceived? Are they the deceived? And it
Right.
it's just it's mental torture for a little bit, to be honest.
Yeah. Well, you've spent years being a part of this angry mob that casts out other people who step away. And so when you're on the receiving end of that, you know exactly what people are saying about you. And when you've
Oh, right.
established those people as your authorities and you've established those people as your family, that's a very difficult thing to walk away from. And there's a lot of gaslighting that goes on that tells you if you leave, something's wrong with you. It's never going to be with
Oh,
us,
yeah.
it's with you. Um, so I guess I would ask you, because I think you've said a lot of amazing things about how to recover from that kind of thinking. But I'm curious, if you were going to talk to someone who is sitting in the pew and they were where you were at the height of your involvement with this movement, what would you say to them if they're thinking about leaving, if they, are trying to stick it out? What would you say to someone who's sitting in the pew of an abusive IFB ministry?
I would tell them that I feel like I would want to ask them, in the deepest part of your soul, what in this place truly makes you unapologetically happy? And if you can't really find anything, that there were many things where I wanted to enjoy things in my life, and it's not sin, quote unquote, but should I really be doing it? Is it the appearance of evil? Is there really, I know that the Bible says that, the truth shall make you free. And if you're not
Right.
free, I don't see how it could possibly be the truth.
No, definitely.
And
And
I thought about that many times. It's simple, even Bible verses that we as people that are a part of those churches, that we overlook, because
mm,
there's just so much going on in your mind that you're battling, and then you're also battling the people that are gossiping about you, but you're trying
right,
to be a good church member, and you kind of feel like you need the pastor and some leaders to see what you're doing, because they've now made it seem like God doesn't see it unless they see it.
right, exactly. No, that's true. And I guess kind of compounding on that question, and this is a question I tend to ask everyone who comes on the show, but having identified some of these problems in, the different experiences that you had, from the outside looking in now, do you think that there's hope for reform of the IFB movement? Or, do you think there's a way that it could shift direction and become a positive thing? Or do you think that it's too built into the DNA of it to be fixed? And I've gotten a mix of answers on this, so I'm curious where you stand on that.
I personally don't believe that it's going to turn around. I don't see it changing, because the real backbone of what I can gather from the Independent Fundamental Baptist Church is it's really about power, and
Mm,
people are not going to give away power. They talk about it in church. Pride is one of the strongest sins, one of the worst sins. But at the end of the day, if you're power hungry, which is what I see in a lot of churches, are you power hungry, or do you have a pride problem? And I just, it's so built into the DNA. It's so traditional, in the sense where if you go to an Independent Fundamental Baptist Church, there's just going to be a staple way of how they do it, and they're really not going to miss a beat. I don't see them turning around, because they're even preaching to the young people. When we pass on, don't let things change. And the young people
right.
are like, yes, we will carry on the torch. Are you carrying on a torch, or are you carrying on a pattern of abuse?
Hmm.
I think they're carrying on a pattern of abuse.
Wow. Well, like I said, I think everything you said, I couldn't have asked for better answers to these questions, and I think you've brought a really good perspective to all of this. So I want to thank you really sincerely for coming on and for sharing your perspective. And I know like with every interview, I think it's going to help a lot of people kind of work through their own situations, because the truth is there's thousands of people who are finding themselves in the same situation you were just a few years ago. So I think that the perspective and hearing that there is freedom and that there is, happiness outside of it is an important message that people need to hear. So thank you so much for doing that.
Thank you for listening to the Preacher Boys podcast. If you appreciated the content on the show, please leave a review on iTunes, and don't forget to connect with us on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter with the handle @PreacherBoysDoc. Additional information can always be found on PreacherBoysDoc.com.